37th lesson of the series and 7th lesson on the addition script. We are learning JavaScript and we are learning JavaScript by examples. In this series called addition, we are trying to recreate this application which is available on this website here, and it is simply an addition script. We have two numbers, a plus symbol, and you provide an answer and you get a response as a tick or a cross. This is what we have done so far. In last videos, we have been learning how to create just one question box that shows two numbers, an addition symbol, and has an input field. And in last video, we created multiple copies of this question box with the help of for loop. And this is the code that we have written so far. Previously, we created one question container, and then we used this for loop to make 50 copies of this container. And as soon as we did that, we have a problem. And let me show you what that problem is. So first of all, let me decrease the number of copies from 50 to 5. So if I save it again and maximize it, refresh it, we now have 5 copies. But notice that the cursor is appearing in the last input box. So no matter how many times I refresh it, we have the cursor within the last input field, and we want this cursor to appear here. We are moving cursor in the input field with the help of this code here. This result variable represents the input field. It was okay when we only had one copy of it. Now that we have multiple copies and this line of code is within this loop, the cursor happens to appear in the last input field here. And this is not what we want. We want the cursor to appear in the first input field. So, and there is a simple way to fix it. Let me just comment this out. So I will say result set attribute, and the name of the attribute is TabIndex, and the TabIndex is of 0. And I will explain what I'm doing. Okay, and then I will say document dot query selector, and then two single quotations, angle bracket, and within this angle bracket I will say tab index is equal to 0 dot and focus method. All right, so if I save it now, maximize it and refresh it, you will notice that the cursor appears in the first input field. As simple as that. Now how is that working? So in order to understand how this is working, we have to understand what is a tab index and what does this document.query selector method does. So as you can see here, we have added is an attribute called tab index with the help of this set attribute method to this input element, and then of course we are creating multiple copies. So this index value, tab index value, will be added to every input field that we have created. In order to explain how tab index attribute works, I have created another document which is called tab index HTML, and this is the code and this is what it looks like. Okay, so this document simply has 7 input elements and I have named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and eventually we will assign these tab index values to these different elements. So the tab index attribute specifies the tab order of an element when the tab button is used. Notice that none of these input elements have the attribute of tab index. By the way, this is an attribute, this is also an attribute, and there are hundreds of them in HTML, and one of them is tab index, and we'll use that attribute to control the navigation of the cursor on the page. Okay, so notice at the moment none of these elements have any tab index value. So if I refresh this and if I press tab button, the cursor should appear in the first input element that it finds. So if I press it again, this is the next one. If I press it again, this is the next one. The one after, the one after, one after, and one after. That's how the tab button works naturally if you don't provide any tab index values. So what I will do, I will assign tab index values to all these elements. So this one has to be 5, and I will copy and I will paste it in all the elements. So this one should have a value of 4. This one should have a value of 6. This one should have a value of -1, and this one should have a value of 2. This one should have a value of 1, and this one should have a value of 3. Okay, so if I save it now, refresh it, we have assigned different tab index values to these different input elements. This is the -1, the one in the middle. This one has a tab index value of 1. This one has a tab index value of 2, and so on and so forth. So if I refresh it and press tab, the cursor should appear in this input field rather than in this input field. Okay, so the next tab order is this, because this element has a tab index value of 2. This should be the next one. This should be the one after. This is the one after, and this is the last one. The cursor will not move into this input field because it has a tab index value of -1. However, if we uncomment this query selector method, which is specifically targeting element that has a tab index value of -1, and it says dot focus, so the cursor will be focused into this input field. If I save it and refresh it, I don't even have to press the tab button. The cursor will be focused in this input field, which has a tab index value of -1, this one. So refresh it, and you can see that the cursor is available in this input field without me having to press the tab button or even click into it. So let's comment this out one more time, and let's give a tab index value of 0 to all the elements. We'll leave this one as it is. So if I save it, it returns the natural tab order. So if I press tab now, the cursor should appear in this one, and then in this next one, the one after, the one after. This one will never be focused, and the last one. So this is what we have done intentionally in this script. Because we forced the focus into this input field, which has been saved as a result as this variable called result, and then we ran a loop, and this piece of code is within the loop, so the cursor was appearing in the last input field. And then what we have simply done, none of these elements had a tab index attribute attached to them, so the cursor was appearing in the last input field. So what we have done, we have assigned a tab index attribute with a value of 0 to all the input elements, no matter how many input elements there are. So if I say console.log and I say result, if I save it, maximize it, refresh it, press F12 to see the console, you can see that all these input elements have a tab index value of 0. So all these input elements, you can see the cursor moving into the input fields. So this is the first one that has a tab index of 0. This one is also 0, this one is also 0, this one is also 0, and this one is also 0. So all these input elements have a tab index value of 0. So if I change the size of the browser one more time and go back to our code, this document.querySelector method returns the first element which has the tab index value of 0 and focuses the cursor into that input field. So that's how the tab index attribute works. Now, in many cases, it is not recommended to change the tab order of the elements, but there are cases when there's nothing that you can do without this attribute. So let me explain one more time. The tab index attribute specifies the tab order of an element when the tab button is used for focusing the cursor. Hence, it is named tab index. The tab index attribute can be used on any HTML element. In this particular case, we are using the tab index on all the input elements that we have created. Using the tab index, we can have absolute control on the order of the tab. And for those who are absolutely new may ask what is an attribute. As I have explained it already, these are the attributes. Okay, so this input field has an ID, has a placeholder, and a tab index of 0, and there are hundreds of attributes that you can assign directly to the HTML elements, as in this case. However, in this case, we created these elements with the help of JavaScript, and we have to assign the tab index value with the help of JavaScript. And the way you do that, you use this set attribute method, provide the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute, and then this is the element that we are setting this attribute to. And query selector method finds the first element which has this attribute with this value and focuses the cursor onto that element. Thank you very much. I hope you learned something today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lesson.